ago about Civil War ballooning. He's a curator for Lighter Than Air, as well as the Wright Collection, as Paul just said. So he's got a, a great portfolio. Uh, the talk today is about the Norge, or the Norgay, or the Norge, or that Norwegian balloon. So Tom, over to you.
All right. Are you seeing the main slide?
Yep, we got it.
Awesome. All right. Yes, as mentioned, is the airship of many names. Just for clarity, the Norge or Norge is the Norwegian pronunciation, depending on what source you look at. It translates to Norway, so it was named the Norway. Norge becomes kind of the English version that you hear a lot, but is not, technically correct to the source material. But you'll see even newsreels from the time where they call it the Norge. So use that as you may. But all right, let me see if I can advance. All right, and there we go. All right, just for quick clarity, and to give a little bit of a definition of what we're talking about. So the Norge is technically a semi-rigid airship. So just as a bit of clarity as to what that means. So what you see on the screen now, this is an example of a rigid airship. This was something that was common or that was being examined at the time. You see countries, Germany, the US, England are building these large rigid airships. They really kind of, rise to fame during World War One, and then there's a lot of development in the interwar years. Anyway, the main thing, though, is that the rigid airstrip ships are very large, and as a result of this large rigid structure that you can see here, for this, for example, is the Shenandoah. It's 680 feet long. It has a lot of capability to hold a lot of gas bags, gives it lift, all that, those good things. So this is a rigid airship, very large, a lot of framework, can carry a lot of lifting gas. So the Norge, this is a kind of a hybrid between a blimp, which has no, or very little structure, and the rigid airships that we see. This had a reinforced structure along the keel, so where this orange arrow is pointing to. It also had a reinforcement in the nose and in the tail. So basically, the nose and the tail were reinforced, and then there was kind of a reinforced keel that connected the two. But there was not that large airframe or the large rigid framework, especially on top of the airship. So it was again kind of a hybrid of the two, and you can really kind of get a sense for that here. So on the right again is this photo of the Shenandoah while it's being constructed, large, that really impressive rigid structure. This is a photo on the left of inside of the Norge, and you can see there is some structure here, but again, this is that what you're looking at is inside that reinforced keel. So again, this gives kind of the benefit of having the sum structure that the Norge has, gives it some strength, but it can't be as large as some of the kind of large airships such as the Shenandoah. So it provides a little, but some of the best of both worlds, but not the capabilities completely of a large airship. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, because you'll see a lot of times in writings the reference to a semi-rigid airship. So this is what they mean. It has some structure, but not nearly as much as kind of the large rigid airships of the day, such as the Shenandoah. But how do we get there? How do we get to the Norge? So it all starts with just this gentleman here. This is Umberto Nobile. He's an Italian engineer, very accomplished. He had been an engineer before World War One. He starts to pivot to aeronautical engineering right before the war breaks out, and then he spends a lot of his time during the First World War acting as an aeronautical engineer for the Italian military. He works for the military factory for aeronautical construction in Italy, and he helps design some of the smaller blimps and other craft that LTA craft that they're using for anti-submarine duty during the war. Uh, he is very interested in the the use of the rigid airships and the other LTA craft during the war, especially by Germany. He spends a lot of time trying to develop, more for the Italian military, and he's the one that really develops this semi-rigid airship concept. He thought the benefit of being a smaller size, yet still having some of that functionality of the large rigid airships was an ideal balance of the material and every capabilities that the Italians would really need. Also, being a smaller country, not having all the resources, semi-rigid airship fit better with kind of their budget and their infrastructure for building such things. One of the first designs he comes up with is the T-34, which is built by the Italians. This is actually sold to the U.S. Army and becomes the Roma. The Roma, unfortunately, crashes in 1922 in Norfolk, Virginia, after it clips some power lines. It effectively ends the U.S. Army's participation in LTA craft, but the design was not necessarily at fault, though it did have a large box tail that was cumbersome. But the work he does on the T-34 helps lead him to the N-ship projects. And the Norge starts its life as the N1. So again, this stems from his World War I experience. It really starts construction in the early 1920s. It's built in 1923 at the factory, at the military factory for aeronautical construction near Rome. The N1 is about 350 feet long, 64 meters in diameter. So it's a little more than half the size of the Shenandoah. So again, that's the flexibility that Nobile is looking for. He wants something that has some of the capabilities of the rigid airships, but is not nearly as large as they are. It has 3 Maybach engines with about 240 horsepower. The top speed is about 50 miles per hour, and it has a range of about 3,300 miles, again, depending on many conditions. So this specific airship, the N1, is not designed for a polar flight by any means, but the long-range capabilities of the N1 is really what helps make it a really great candidate for that mission. So the next question we get into is why polar exploration, right? The Norge kind of reaches its fame for being the first to fly across the North Pole. Why is that? Why are there even people doing this? So the poles, both the South Pole and the North Pole, become a huge area of interest for both countries and just people in general. The 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s. There's a mix of nationalism, people wanting to set records for their country. There's a mix of military exploration. Are the resources here? How can we use these areas? And then just an interest in exploration, right? These are areas that are kind of yet to be explored. So when there's areas that are yet to be explored, there's generally someone who wants to go explore them. So the U.S. explorers Frederick Cook and Robert Peary claimed to go to the North Pole in 1908 and 1909, respectively. The claims are disputed, as some of their proof is just doubted and debated even at the time. So a lot of people turn to aviation as an option to get to the North Pole without any doubt. The increased developments in aviation really kind of offers a new tool for being able to make it to the North Pole without the difficulties of having to go on the ground via dog sled, things like that. Uh, Lieutenant Commander Richard Byrd, he uses this Fairchild FC-2W2, known as the Stars and Stripes, for pioneering mapping and reconnaissance flights on two different expeditions, one between 1928 and 1930, and then after 3 years of being buried in the snow, 1933 to 1935. So this is, after our period for the Norge. But again, this is again that an example of an aircraft that is being used for this polar exploration. This is something that really captures the attention of the world as they're doing this. Um, the This aircraft is not used for kind of the cross polar, flights. On November 29th, in 1929, Richard Byrd and a crew of three flew over the South Pole in a Ford trimotor Floyd Bennett. So that trimotor is actually on display at the Ford Museum. So they're the first to fly over the South Pole. The first to reach the South Pole on foot, however, happens well before that flight by this person. This is Roald Amundsen. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation. Please forgive me. He is a famous Norwegian explorer of the time. He is really known for his expertise and ability in exploring these polar regions. Um, so he and four other crew members make it to the geographical South Pole on December 14th, 1911. This gives him global fame. And again, this is a huge accomplishment that is kind of seen around the world. He is once he reaches the South Pole, he is very interested in reaching the North Pole, but he's seeing what's going on. He's seeing the difficulty that will also bring of reaching the North Pole, mainly because there's no body of land that's very close to the North Pole from which they could start out on. At the South Pole, there is land that they could land, set up a camp, and then kind of make the trek into the actual pole. For the North Pole, there is no land that is very close, other than some small islands off the coast of Norway, which become critical to the Norge's flight. But again, getting to the North Pole is a completely different experience than getting to the South Pole. Nobile mentions in his book about his polar flights that he received a telegram from Amundsen on July 15th, 1925, suggesting that they have a meeting and he wants to have a conference with Nobile because he really thinks that Nobile can help, they can make a trek to the North Pole. That between their expertise, Nobile with his airship and Amundsen with his polar exploration experience, he thinks they can make a really good team to actually successfully make this trek. Amundsen had tried with Lincoln Ellsworth and crews to reach the North Pole via two Dornier seaplanes, but were unable to make it that far north. They had some aircraft problems. They had engine problems and were forced to land. One of the aircraft is damaged. They kind of have to pile into the other one just to make it back. So he understands the difficulties that await trying to get to the North Pole. So again, he's seeing this as a different opportunity, a different tool that can make that happen. Nobile travels to Oslo on July 25th, and they basically start sketching out a plan of how they could do this. They want to get the airship, which was currently in Rome. They want and get it all the way up to Kings Bay, which is off the coast of one of the northmost islands in Norway. And they could set up a temporary hangar there with fuel and supplies. And then once they get to Kings Bay, they could refuel, restock their supplies, and then they could fly over the pole from Kings Bay and keep going until they reach Alaska. So that's the plan that they come up with, is the range that the Norge offers gives them this opportunity to make this really long flight across the pole. Amundsen really wants to move on this plan. He wants to get the flight going as soon as possible. But because that time span is short, there's not really time to build a new airship for this. So that's when the N1, the Norgay, becomes the kind of option uh, that Nobile sees as the best possibility for making this happen in such a short time span. So the Aero Club of Norway, which is a private organization, they actually lead the financial aspects of this expedition. They had received a commitment of $120,000 from Lincoln Ellsworth. So he's the American that comes along and helps sponsor, help financially fund the trip. Um, on the 1st of September 1925, the Aero Club negotiates successfully with the Italian government, and they come to an agreement for the sale of the N1 kind of for this specific mission. And the Italian government does so for numerous reasons. Most importantly, it really gives them a boost for their kind of national airship program, right? If they sell this craft to the Aero Club and they are successful in this strengthens their reputation as being, leading the way in LTA, development. So it's beneficial to Italy for that purpose. That's one of the reasons why the Italian government is involved. Also, Nobile is a respected aeronautical engineer. He is going to be leading kind of that effort for the mission. So again, there's a combination of national pride and just national interest that lead for that kind of successful negotiation. Nobile comments in his book that this official kind of sale and relationship between the Aero Club of Norway and the Italian government is the first one signed by the new Minister of Aviation, Benito Mussolini. So that's an interesting footnote of history. Mussolini is very supportive of this. Again, he really sees it from the nationalistic, national pride side of things. So he becomes very much a fan of Nobile's, and he is really pushing the success of this mission. So the N1 officially becomes the Norgay. In this picture, you can see here, this is the christening event where they officially kind of rename it from the N1 to the Norgay. So this is the so once it is officially sold to the Aero Club, Nobile needs to modify the N1 a bit, now the Norgay, to make this Arctic trip. Some of the modifications involve strengthening the structure. When the N1 had originally been built, some of the harsh winds and things that Nobile is expecting in the Arctic were not really planned. So he needs to strengthen the structure to be ready for a different conditions than operating in and around Italy. One of the other items is he is very concerned with the weight of the craft. He knows that he's going to have to carry a lot of fuel, and he's going to have to carry kind of a large crew to make this trip successful. So he gets to work lightening the control car for the journey. That has, plus and minuses. He does successfully get the weight down by reducing the size of the airship control car. The problem is that it sets him up for a very cramped journey during the actual flight, which numerous members of the flight talk about the tight conditions of the control car, but that was what was necessary. The Aero Club, once the sale goes through, the Aero Club gets to work negotiating the next steps of the trip. So one of the things they do is they negotiate with England and with Russia for the temporary use of hangars in those countries, just so that they can get the airship from Rome to Norway. So they determine that the best route is going to be a Rome to England, England to Oslo, Oslo to Leningrad, Leningrad to Kings Bay route, which I'll show you in a second. So for a total of 4,500 miles before they even make the Arctic crossing. So it's quite the endeavor just to get the airship into the position to make the trip across the Arctic. And both Nobile and Amundsen are really pushing for this May 1926 window because April and May are thought to be the best time weather-wise to make this trip. That was really one of the major determining factors for timing of the trip was what weather are they going to have, and making sure that the weather is as good as possible for this trip to make sure that it is successful. All right, so this is the map that shows the route just to get into position for the Arctic hop. So as I mentioned, the Aero Club negotiates with England and Russia, allowing for the use of temporary hangars. One is at the RNAS Pelham, which is kind of in this area. And then the other is for one in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, after a stop in Oslo. So the stop in Oslo is a short stop. It's really much more of a promotional stop. The King of Norway is there, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, the Nobile gets to work. He starts overhauling the Norge to start prepping it for the flight. He is ready by early April, and again, they're really trying to get this May flight date. So they get to work getting supplies ready, and they set off. So they leave Rome on the 10th of April, 1926, and they arrive the next day at RNAS Pelham, so April 11th. They only spend a short time at Pelham. Basically, they refuel, resupply, and they arrive on April 13th to Oslo, Norway. Sorry, they leave the 13th, arrive the 14th in Oslo. Again, it's very much a promotional stop, for the Norge, promote the kind of the Norwegian effort to make this polar flight. Nobile does mention that as they're kind of flying into Oslo, there are people by the thousands in the streets and on rooftops to welcome them there. So there is this great excitement in Oslo. The King of Norway comes to greet them. Nobile mentions how he's kind of waiting at the bottom of the mooring mast for them, and they show him the airship and things of that. But again, the stop in Oslo is a short one. Again, they refuel and make some minor repairs while they're there before they set off on the next leg of the trip. So they leave in the early morning hours of April 15th. And they fly 740 miles in 17 hours to make it to Leningrad, to that hangar. At this point, the crew is getting tired. Nobile mentions that he'd been up for about 60 hours at this point, trying to make these hops and making sure that they can get to their next destination. Once they get to the hangar in Leningrad, they find the Russian government is very excited to help them on this, with this trip. They had negotiated when they were negotiating with Russia to use this hangar in Leningrad. The hangar had been hadn't been used for years. The Russian government actually agrees to help restore the hangar during that time to make it in good shape for this trip. And then when they get there, there's Russian soldiers available to kind of help the airship when it gets there. There's the foreign minister and all sorts of things. So the Russian government is very excited about this effort. They're very excited to help and be a part of this effort. And once the Norge gets to Russia, they actually stay there for a few weeks. They had suffered some minor damage during the trip, so they have to make repairs. They just have to, and then the other thing is that the camp in Svalbard and Kings Bay, up here on the islands north of Norway, there's delays in getting that camp set up. They send a crew ahead of time to build a temporary hangar, to bring fuel and supplies and spare parts and all those things, and they are delayed due to weather and other factors. So they spend some time in Russia waiting for that hangar to be constructed, waiting for those supplies to be there, waiting for everything to be ready before they make that trip. And this trip from Leningrad to Kings Bay is one of the scarier ones that they're preparing for. The weather over the Barents Sea is very rough, very strong winds. Winds can shift suddenly, so Nobile is very concerned and wants to make sure that they are ready for when they make that trip. They know that this is going to be a very difficult leg of the trip. So again, they want to make sure that everything is in place when they actually set off for that. So after they receive word that the temporary hangar is ready and all that is ready to go, they finally kind of get ready to leave. They finally leave Russia on the 5th of May, 1926. They make a brief stop at a temporary mooring mast near Vadsø, Norway, which is right on the coast before they finally cross the sea. Again, they basically refuel. They wait for the weather to clear a little bit before making that kind of hop across to Kings Bay. So they finally arrive in Svalbard on May 7th, 1926. In his book, Nobile mentions how the flight across the Barents Sea was not as bad as they had feared. So he's very grateful for that. He said he's kind of on high alert for that whole flight. But he said the weather is not great, but it's not terrible. The winds are not great, but they're not terrible. They do suffer some minor damage again during the flight, but nothing they can't repair. So he said that they are kind of pleasantly surprised by the flight, and he kind of sees it as an omen of good luck that, oh, if this part of the journey is okay, then we're set. So this is the camp that they set up at Kings Bay for the to have the airship here ready to go for kind of the final hop. So again, this is the last camp they have until they make the big main flight. So they set up this temporary hangar. You can see it here on the left. It didn't actually have a roof on it. The main purpose of it was to keep the airship from getting battered around in the winds. So it was basically tall enough to let the airship rest below winds that might want to move it and damage it. But that's really the main purpose of that hangar is to protect it from the wind. So after they arrive at Kings Bay, they set to work preparing the Norge for the final leg of the trip. The one of the things that's interesting is while they're kind of at camp, Richard Byrd actually comes. He comes and chats with them. So he and his crew are up there also trying to make a trip to the North Pole. And he actually mentions, so Nobile in his book comments that as they're having a pleasant discussion with Byrd, he actually mentions that he and his crew are going to fly before the Norge, not necessarily because they want to race to be the first to the pole, but he says that if anything happens, he likes the Norge being there because he hopes the Norge will come and look for them if they have any incident. So it's an interesting note of he basically asks Nobile, hey, if we go down, you'll come search for us, right? And Nobile says in his book that, of course, if anything had happened, we would have, launched immediately to go see if we could find them. But that's, again, an interesting footnote. So once they get to Kings Bay, they really get to work. There's a lot to do. Some crew had been there early that was there to set up everything for their arrival. They also are helping kind of prepare the Norge for this final hop. They have to do a lot of work on the airship from things that happened during its flight thus far. The port engine had suffered a broken crankshaft during the flight. So they actually have to remove the entire engine and replace it with a new engine and then rebalance it and all those type of things. So that's a major overhaul that has to happen. The stabilizing surfaces had to be inspected and repaired. The lower keel had suffered some damage during some of the flight. So they had to reinforce that and strengthen and fix some of that damage. The rudder had gotten torn during during the flight. Again, they had to repair those surfaces. And then the other thing was they swapped out some of the gear they had been using just to make the flight with emergency gear. So Amundsen had kind of told them if anything happens and we go down, our best chance of survival is having emergency survival gear. So that's one of the things that they have to load up onto the airship that they hadn't needed for the flight up to this point. And Nobile talks about how he and the other crew of the ship are very concerned with the balancing the weight and the fuel. So there is a lot of calculations that are happening as to how much fuel do we need, how much there's even debate. He has measurements for every crew member that's going to make the flight down to the pounds that he can figure out exactly how much weight they can carry and all that. He also talks about how they've been using water ballast up to this point. They empty those tanks of water ballast and they're going to use fuel as ballast for the hop because they're going to, as they use the fuel, that will help with them. But that also is a bit risky. But it's the best way to carry the amount of fuel they need. Again, this is going to be the longest part of the flight. So he's making sure that they are as prepared as possible. So after this 4 days of intense work getting everything ready, they are ready to launch the airship. So some of the crew that had come with them for the flight up to the Kings Bay are swapped out for other crew members that are going to make the final flight. So in total, there are 16 members that make the flight from Kings Bay to Alaska. So it's Raoul Amundsen, it's Lincoln Ellsworth. Lincoln Ellsworth and Amundsen meet them in Kings Bay, so they were not on the ferrying flight from Rome, but they're waiting for them there. So they board once they are there. Then you have Nobile, he's the pilot, and then he has numerous members of the crew, as well as Frederick Ramm, who is a journalist that the Norwegian government really wanted on board to kind of document this historic flight. So it's the 16 of them make up the final crew for this flight. The rest of the crew, the riggers, and everyone else involved, 6 Italians, 5 Norwegians, and 1 Swede. It makes up the crew. They prepare the Norge. They get it out of the hangar, so you can see it here after they've successfully maneuvered it out of the hangar. They board the ship, and at 9:50 a.m. on the 11th of May, they officially launch the ship. Nobile says that as they're launching, Amundsen jokes that he quotes Amundsen as saying, quote, "On board, naturally, I had the easiest task of all. The others were busy keeping the airship going and guiding it to its goal. My function was simply that of an explorer who was looking at the ground below, studying its geographical character, and watching particularly to see if there appeared any signs of a possible Arctic continent." So Nobile talks about how while he and the crew are moving and running and making sure everything is working as they are, Amundsen keeps a lookout, making sure he's watching everything that's going on. So the flight actually goes pretty well. So besides the cramped living conditions, they don't face too many major hurdles, but it is still a very difficult flight. So as mentioned, the control car was cramped with all the gear and the people need to fly. If sleep occurred, it tended to be somewhere in a corner and for a short time. Nobile mentions constantly as people moving around, there's kind of always stepping over people and trying to make their way around these cramped conditions. One of the things that they do encounter early in the flight, and it becomes a constant struggle for the length of the flight, is fog. So Amundsen and Nobile had really hoped to avoid as much fog as possible with their timing, this April-May timeframe, but they still do encounter fog. One of the reasons that fog is troublesome is not only does it make it hard to navigate and see the ground below, but fog turns into ice on metal surfaces, which can weigh down the airship and also lead to more fuel burn. So one of the things that has to happen during this kind of final stretch of the flight is there is a lot of adjustments of altitude as they're trying to avoid fog, and find optimal flying altitudes throughout the flight. So that you see that a lot during the flight of they are constantly making adjustments trying to avoid fog. At 1:30 a.m. in the early morning hours of May 12th, they officially reached the North Pole. The flight to the North Pole was nerve-wracking, but okay. Nobile talks about, again, the fog was the biggest issue they dealt with. But they officially reached the pole at 1:30 a.m. They drop a group of flags that had been brought for that occasion. It includes a Norwegian flag and a U.S. flag, as well as an Italian flag. Nobile made sure that the Italian flag was the largest of the three, but they drop it onto the ice at the pole. They decrease their altitude to about 600 feet and kind of fly around a few times, taking measurements and just, again, documenting this moment as the flags flutter below. And so at that point, they've done it. They've reached the North Pole. But that was only a portion of the flight. Now they need to make it to Alaska, right? Some of the previous Arctic flights, the plan had been to fly to the North Pole and then return back to Kings Bay for back to base camp. With them, they're crossing the pole and they're keeping going, which sets up so the getting to the North Pole was almost the easy part of the trip. Now they experience the next hardship of the trip, and that's getting to Alaska. So for the remainder of the flight, they have to keep an altitude. Nobile says in his logs that it's an average of about 2,000 feet, but sometimes they have to go up, sometimes they have to go down. They continue to deal with fog. That actually became one of the biggest issues that they dealt with. And what starts to happen is as the fog freezes, it tends to stick to the metal surfaces, but it also sticks to the bag of the Norge. And then pieces of ice start to dislodge from the bag and fall down. As it falls down, it hits the propellers on the engines, and that causes the ice to get flung into the airship. So they actually suffer numerous bits of damage from falling ice getting flung into the airship, causing tears and punctures. Luckily, they don't ever have a tear of the gas bags. It seems that all the damage is always to the external structure, though there is some damage here and there also that occurs, again, from this kind of flinging ice. The ice also adds to their fuel burn, which Nobile is very concerned about. He's kind of keeping a constant measurement of the fuel as they're making this trip. Once they're past the pole, the other aspect of this is they're in uncharted territory. The kind of the land beyond the pole was literally uncharted. It was just unknown area beyond the pole, the route that they're flying. So they are also trying to take measurements, see what is down below, because there's still debate as to whether there's any land mass at the North Pole. There is land down in the South Pole, so there is debate. Is there anything? We don't know. So that's one of the other things they're keeping an eye out on, is for a landmass below. So at 9:15 p.m., they have to rise up to 3,500 feet and then even a little bit more, again, trying to avoid the fog. And they are just keeping going up and down during this length of the flight. Nobile mentions how it's one of the most nerve-wracking parts of the flight. Again, they're in uncharted territory. They're dealing with fog. So this is, for him, he says, this is the hardest part for him personally. By 6:45 a.m. on May 13th, according to their charts, they should be approaching Alaska. So they're getting excited. They're starting to keep an eye out for the coast. And then at 8:40 a.m., They finally recognize, they see the coast of Alaska, they fly a bit more, and they recognize Wainwright, Alaska, confirming that they've made it, that they're on course, they've made it to Alaska. And Nobile and several of the crew members mentioned how that's the first time they really breathed during that whole flight, because now they're back over land. So anything else that happens from this point, they figure they can solve those problems. But now they're kind of back to land. They've successfully crossed this uncharted region. So once they see Wainwright, Nobile makes the decision to kind of follow the coast of Alaska. He wants to make sure he can keep track of where he is. So at this point, they'd been flying for, he says 76 hours. They had maybe minutes of sleep here and there. One of the other issues that starts happening though at this point is they breathe this sigh of relief. They found Alaska, but the adrenaline starts to wear off, right? The crew is exhausted, Nobile is exhausted. The physical endurance of the trip is really starting to get to them. So this is where things start getting even more difficult. The fog continued to be a problem even when they get to Alaska, causing them to have to kind of increase and decrease their altitude. They were really hoping to make it to Nome, Alaska. That was where they had kind of planned on going. That was where kind of media and others were expecting them. But the constant fog, the just physical weariness, and then an increase in strong winds really makes that difficult. So Nobile decides that he doesn't want to risk it. He doesn't want to risk trying to make it all the way to Nome, Alaska. He's worried about his fuel. He's worried about his crew. He's worried about the growing winds. One of his biggest concerns is being pushed out to sea. So not being able to kind of stay on that coast of Alaska. And he's very concerned that the winds are going to push him away from land, and he doesn't want that. So he makes the decision that they're not going to push it all the way to Nome. They load a landing sack, which is essentially a sack they load with supplies and whatnot and attach to the keel with a rope. They fly low and they drop it out, and it kind of acts like an anchor for them as they off gas. So once they start to make this landing procedure, they actually land pretty well, judging they didn't have a formal mooring mast or anything like that. So at 7:30 a.m. May 14th GMT, but 8:30 p.m. of the 13th Alaska time, the airship officially kind of settles down. They release some gas, have some rip panels. The airship slightly rolls once they actually make contact with the ground. And they realize, or they confirm with some of the locals that they've made it to Teller, Alaska, which is about 100 miles from Nome. So they didn't make it all the way to Nome, but they are pretty close. So the crew stay in Teller for about 18 days. They dismount parts and start packing up the airship so it could be shipped back to Europe. So that's what you see here, is them actually kind of disassembling the airship and salvaging what they could. And after that kind of 18-day period of working on the airship, they eventually do make it to Nome, and then from there they start going on their ways to Nobile returns to Rome, Umundsen returns to Norway. The crew go back to where they are. This is hailed as an amazing accomplishment. It makes also international press is lauds the crew for this amazing flight. And again, the fact that they make it to Alaska is kind of definitive proof of this length. They made this long flight. So here is a period map of the route they take. You can kind of see it as focused on the pole. So on the right, you can see Kings Bay. That's where they start, in the islands to the north of Norway. And they basically fly a straight line through the pole. And then when they make it to Alaska, here on the left of the map, you can see they start kind of wrapping around the coast until they land in Teller. So The crossing of the Arctic from Spitsbergen to Alaska takes them a little over almost 71 hours, and they cover almost 3,200 miles. Between, the length of the entire trip is almost 3,200 miles. So here's the map without the circle. The total flight time is generally about 171 hours. So that's from when they leave Rome to when they get to Teller, Alaska. So the entirety of flight time is 171 hours, and they cover about 7,800 miles between all of the trip, and that's both from Rome. So from Rome to Teller, Alaska, the entire trip is about 7,800 miles. And then one of the biggest accomplishments that they have is they prove that there is no landmass up in this region. Again, this area in the map that you're seeing kind of to the left where it says ice pole, this area was what was generally listed as just unknown. There hadn't been a lot of exploration in that area. So that is one of the major accomplishments that they have, is they can prove that there is nothing there. They and also that they could fly across the pole. So one of the big questions that comes up with the Norge flight is who was actually first. So again, Richard Byrd, and so Nobile mentions meeting Richard Byrd while they're preparing for the flight. On May 9th, 1926, Byrd and Floyd Bennett fly for almost 16 hours, and they claim that they've reached the North Pole and then return back to base camp. They are hailed national heroes. They're awarded the Medal of Honor. Both of them are given the Medal of Honor. They receive promotions in the U.S. Navy. It's a huge deal. But even at the time, there is some debate as to whether or not they actually made it all the way to the pole. So Nobile mentions in his book, Byrd and Bennett's flight raised the question whether they really had reached the pole. From a recent study published by Professor G.H. Lindquist of the University of Uppsala, it appears that given the performance figures of the airplane and the prevalent weather conditions, they could not have traveled so far in the time allotted. So Byrd does, one of the reasons they do suffer an oil leak during the flight and are forced to come back. So there is debate that they were flying in the right direction, but there is debate that they made it maybe 80% of the way to the pole before having to turn back and fly home. So as a result of this, again, the debate continues even today. In the early 2000s, his diary was reviewed, the diary he had written during the flight. And there's debate about one of the measurements they take seems to be there's too much accuracy for the type of instrumentation they had. Again, there's debate that happens both at the time and today as to whether or not Byrd and Bennett are the first. Regardless, what tends to be stated is the Norge makes the first verified or first confirmed flight over the pole. There's no debate that they make it, especially because they go over the pole and make it all the way to Alaska. So that's always the kind of asterisk that many historians put, is the Norge is the first verified, first confirmed flight over the pole, without any doubt. So we are rapidly approaching the 100th anniversary of this amazing flight. So it might be a great time to highlight the Norge and its accomplishments. As you can see here, we do have some artifacts from the flight in the museum collection, and some are currently on display at the Udvar-Hazy Center. This is the LTA case, as I'm sure you're familiar with out there. So the first the largest object, the most major object, is this fuel tank from the flight. This was a gift of the Port of Oakland Board of Commissioners. The paperwork did not explain how they got it, but it just says that they gave it, and we are grateful for it. You can see in this picture how the fuel tank was mounted. You can see that these are some of the fuel tanks mounted. They kind of had a gravity system that helped as the fuel was burned. So this is, again, an example of the fuel tanks as mounted in the airship, and we are lucky enough to have one on display. The other piece of the Norge we have is circled here in red. It's a piece of structure from the Norge. I spent some time specifically trying to locate where this would have been from. I estimate that it's probably one of these more kind of central girders from the airship. I'm not quite certain if the wire from this picture, the gauge is thick enough. It might have been one of the other girders. But that is my estimate, is it's most likely one of the main support girder structure, just based off of the size and the gauge of the material. But that's definitely not a certain. That is just my hypothesis based off of looking at some of the photos and judging where it could have come from. It also doesn't say in the paperwork that it's from the control car. It just says from the structure. So that's also why I think it's probably a piece of one of these structures here. We also have some archival assets for the Norge. We have a great collection that's currently digitized on SOVA of 9 black and white photos, basically from when the N1 was handed over, as part of the ceremony when it officially became the Norge. But yes, if you ever want to see, there are some fantastic photos in that grouping of that time. Finally, for the 100th anniversary, we will be launching a website, basically a landing page on our website that highlights the Norge and highlights some of the items that we have in the collection. Not only the ones that we showed you, but some of the new ones that are, or some of the items that are not currently on display, but in the collection. The website will also have some newsreel footage. We located a newsreel that actually, it was made by the Norwegian government, but the newsreel itself was a German copy. But somebody digitized it in ultra high resolution and made it available online. So we're going to use that. We're going to highlight kind of some of the newsreel footage of the flight, a lot of it documented by the reporter that was on board. And we're also going to highlight some of the artifacts we have in the collection that are not on display. So this, for example, is a can of food that was carried aboard the flight, during the mission. We also have, and this is my favorite artifact. So this is a piece of fabric from the Norge that kind of contains a written account of the flight. You can see here on the upper left corner, this kind of lists the stops they made and includes the flight hours and the kind of miles covered. Some of this was discrepancy from what I saw in some of the logbooks, but so I did not sit and actually calculate the full hours. The numbers I gave previous are from Nobile's book, and he says he's referencing the logbook. I'm not certain where these numbers come from, so there is some discrepancy, but it's not off by much. The other really interesting thing here on the right, you can see the different members of the crew, and it kind of lists their nationalities. So you see American, Lincoln Ellsworth, Norwegian, Amundsen, and then it gets down to Italian, Nobile, etc. So yeah, we're gonna highlight this artifact and talk about some of the information on here and use it as a way of pointing out some of this information to people that visit the website. And then finally, I just wanted to share this quote because I thought it was really cool. So at the time, there is, even at the time of the flight, Richard Byrd, he kind of gets the first, the award for being the first there. But the international press is still really highlights this trip. It's a big deal. It makes the news all over, especially the fact that it was a longer flight. The fact that it went across the pole and goes from Norway to Alaska is really hailed as a major aeronautical accomplishment, and frankly, it was. So even though they might not, the debate of who was first kind of rages on, the importance of the flight, the significance of the flight is not debated. And I just thought this was an amazing quote. To the Northwest Passage and the conquest of the South Pole, Raoul Amundsen has now added the pioneer achievement of a voyage in an airship across the Arctic Sea from the old world to the new. Lincoln Ellsworth, the intrepid American, and Colonel Nobile, the daring Italian navigator, share with their chief the distinction of the great adventure. When such things can be done, heroism is still with us, to be lauded and held up as an example. I just thought that was a super cool quote. This is in the New York Times on May 16th. So again, that old world to new flight is a really cool aspect, and I think one of the most enduring legacies of this trip. It's something that we can really highlight to visitors as, why do we highlight this flight? Because it was really important, and it was a really amazing accomplishment, especially for the time. All right.
Oh, thanks, Tom. That's really fascinating. Um, yeah, fascinating. Several questions. Um, are there other Norgay artifacts, significant artifacts, besides the
Uh,
ones that we have?
we have some other pieces of fabric, and some other kind of small pieces of structure, but the ones I highlighted are kind of the gems. The other piece of fabric are, piece of fabric. So that's basically it. We don't have a huge collection. We do have a piece of the gas bag material. We have a picture in the collection that came with that gas bag material. But the ones I highlighted are kind of the most interesting, and the main ones.
Right. Besides the control car, was there other people space inside the envelope?
Just in that picture I showed, like where the fuel tanks were, there was a catwalk there, and that's where they could go and access the engines and access, the things they had to do. One of the things that they talk about is they would regularly climb outside of the 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 bag. So one of the crew there was a ladder attached that he would go and help look at things on the outside. So in that regards, no, some of the access was just going outside, but there is that catwalk where they have access to kind of the internal components, the fuel, making repairs there. But that's about it. There was not a lot of people space other than the catwalk in the main gas bag. It's basically the control car.
How did Nobile and Amundsen and Ellsworth get along?
Um, that is a fun question. Generally well, especially for the trip. Um, After the trip, Nobile and Umundsen have a falling out. Um, Umundsen writes a kind of his account of the journey, and he is very critical of Nobile's abilities. He says that he was very panic stricken and made very bad decisions during the flight. He thinks that they could have made it to Nome, and that the only reason they didn't was because Nobile panics. Um, and I think the truth is somewhere probably in between. One of the things that Nobile even admits in his book is that as the trip went on and the weariness set in and the lack of sleep, that he's he was not in the, I forget the phrase he uses, but essentially it's in the clearest of mind. So I don't think Amundsen's critiques are completely false. However, other people defend Nobile and say that Amundsen goes too far. So they have a real falling out. But when they make a second flight in the Italia, and that crashes, Umundsen is one of the first ones to jump to offer to go help rescue the crew, and he's actually lost. He disappears in that flight, never to be seen again. So they have a falling out, but there is still a mutual respect, I guess, that happens. One of the other things that fuels kind of this falling out is the kind of the rise in nationalistic pride, right? Italy, Norway, they're all trying to use it as we're the best because we did this thing. Norway is without our money and without our expert, this would have never happened. Italy is without our airship and without our pilot, it would have never happened. So we're the most important. So that doesn't help, right? That builds that tension that happens as kind of there's geopolitical tension that builds from that. So it's not the worst, but it's not the best either.
What was the common language on the flight?
So according to Nobile and several of the crew, English was deemed kind of the language. However, Nobile admits, and then all others confirm, that in the heat of the moment, and especially as he got more and more tired, he would scream things in Italian. And he mentions one specific thing where he doesn't realize he's speaking Italian. So he's yelling at a command in Italian, and all the Norwegians are just sitting staring at him. and then finally he has to say it in English, and then they get to work. So English was the official language, but as stress built and as time went on and as weariness grew in, other languages definitely crept in.
Mhm. In regards of, in terms of the icing, besides the altitude, was there any other de-icing capability?
Not really. They occasionally, I know that one point he mentions that one of the members um goes out and kind of hits some of the ice on like this ladder trying to get it off. But what happens is as it falls and it hits the propellers and it gets flung in, that's actually causing more issues. So the main thing they're trying to do is deal with their altitude. They're hoping that they're trying to keep the ice from forming or forming too thick, right? If it's a thin crust, it's not as problem. It's when it gets thicker and like large chunks break off. That's really what sets them up for problems.
One of the sharp-eyed, eagle-eyed docents noticed that in the picture of the inside of the control car, there's two portraits, it looks like. Do you know who those are?
Yes. I don't. I was trying to find that out. So that those kind of sepia tone images I used, those are actually stills from the um newsreel footage that we had. I think it's the king and queen of Norway, but I couldn't confirm that. Just looking at them and trying to figure it out because it also flashes by quickly. So, I was sitting there trying to compare. I think it's the king and queen of Norway, but I 100% could be wrong on that. I don't. That's not at all um. It's not proof. It's just my estimates from looking at it.
Well, one of the docents puts that in the chat as well. That's Sig's guess as well. How did they navigate, and how did they know they reached the pole?
Um, some of it was measurements with sextant. They were taking sun sightings and things of that during the trip. They also had, oh, what's the other instrument? I'm gonna forget it now. They did have a radio they were using for some. During the trip from the North Pole to Alaska, they actually lose their radio. Some of it there is thought that it may have gotten damaged, like the antenna got damaged during icing and de-icing and whatnot. But the radio is one way they're also using to help figure out. But the main way with the pole was they were taking readings to kind of figure out sextant readings, navigational readings. They also, one of the things they had done was they had kind of done dead reckoning to get to the area. So they were like, well, we should be close to the pole. And then once they got there, they were able to take readings to confirm they were there.
Do you know how close the track was of Charles Blair's flight in the P-51 to the
I'm not
north?
certain. I'm not certain how their tracks compare. I would have to pull up his map.
Two more questions. What was the gas used? Was it hydrogen?
It was, and Nobile talks about how one of the things he did excuse me, as part of that preparation was he wanted to make sure that the hydrogen was as pure as possible because that impacted his calculations for lift and all of that. One of the things he talks a lot about in his book was they had to consider the quality of the hydrogen, the pressure, atmospheric pressure and temperature were kind of their biggest factors, and that determined their lift capabilities, which then determined how much fuel they could have, how much supplies they could have, all of that. So he mentions in his book, which his book is, I don't know if this is going to show up, My Polar Flights. It's a really good read. He's a pretty good writer. He specifically mentions how that's one of his concerns when they're prepping the flight in Italy is to get as pure a hydrogen as possible for the flight, because again, that was going to impact his calculations for lifting, his lifting equations as the flight went on, and then especially once they made that big flight.
Last question. How did they return from Alaska, and was shipping readily available?
I tried to find that. I didn't find a lot of details. A lot of not only Nobiles, but a few other. There was another crewman. They basically said they packed things up and got it shipped. I know that the Teller, Alaska, was basically a mining town. It didn't have a huge population, but there was some infrastructure. there again to support the mine. So I know that was one of the ways um they were able to get stuff packed up and shipped. And then they didn't pack up the entire airship. There were parts that were abandoned due to damage, or there was some scavenging too. They also talk about having to chase off people of stop taking stuff from the airship. So they're not able to salvage everything, but they do try to ship as much as they can. Um, and Nobile doesn't necessarily think they'll ever be able to rebuild it for flight. He says he's more wants to make sure that they have the stuff to build more airships. So the hope would be to reconstruct N1 and continue to do it, but he said in his book, even he was kind of cognizant that I can hope that this happens, but I don't know if it will. And in fact, the Italia is based off of the N1 design, but it's slightly larger, so it's a new built airship. It's not, they don't take the N1 and kind of repurpose it for the Italia. But yeah, so I'm not certain exactly how they did it. I do know there is some infrastructure, and like I said, most of what I could find is just listed as they packed it up and shipped it home.
Jim Shear points out that Svalbard now hosts one of the largest, if not the largest, satellite ground station in the world with over 100 antennas in its antenna farm. NASA installed the first antenna decades ago. It's the best location for communicating and tracking satellites in polar orbits. And he has a link here if anyone wants to go in the chat. This is great, Tom. Thanks a lot. Fascinating. I think you increased our knowledge of the Norge at least 500%. And again, it's time for you to start thinking about your next talk.
Happy to do so.
John Haney has his hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, John.
I'd just like to make a comment. But before COVID, we used to have regular meetings with the curators.
Mhm.
That kind of ended after COVID, and it never came back. You have been the one that has been in touch with us the most, and I just want to. I'm sure this is true of the rest of us, but I really appreciate these sessions. We learn a lot from them, and it's a chance for us to interact with the curator. And you've been very generous with your time to do that. So thank you for this.
Oh, you're very welcome. I love doing it, and I learned, like, I had, good knowledge of this, but just putting this together, I learned so much. I never read his full book, or at least the chapter on this. So just reading, his account of things, which again, you always have to take it with a grain of salt, right? It's coming later. Of course, he's self-promotional, but he had a lot of good information in there, and he specifically cites the log book. So I have to believe that, if that's the log, that's probably accurate. So yeah, it's great for me too, and like I said, I like sharing it, and I'm glad you can find it useful.
And we learned a lot. You learned something about satellite ground stations too.
I did.
So thank you.
Who knew Svalbard was still a big deal? I figured it was a desolate ice, island that no one uses anymore. This is great. It's still important.
Thank you.
The Norge paving the way.
Scott, you have your hand up.
Oh yeah.
Hey,
Scott.
Hey, Tom, I just unmuted myself. Hey, I want to echo what John just said. One of my personal barometers about how good I thought the training was, and this is going back for decades, is when I hear the individual come and talk to us about whatever, space, air, whatever. When he or she finishes his discussion, first thing I want to do is go back into their gallery, their expertise, and do a deep dive, just me looking at their artifacts and what have you. And sure, I'm a Hazy docent. I know the LTA case, but it's like, wait a minute. That means I have to go back when we get in there in a few days to go and look at the fuel tank. I know it where it is. I've walked by it a billion times. Now I'm going to go look at it. Good job, young man.
Thank you. And again, it's something next month, we're coming up on the anniversary. It's a great time to highlight it. It's something I think I walked by that fuel tank for the longest time until finally, I didn't even know how it worked. That picture I showed you, I've been looking everywhere. I finally saw that in the newsreel. It was like, oh, that's how they mounted the fuel tanks.
And one more thing is, it was just echoed a minute ago. When you put up the map, it's from A to B over the North Pole is 76 hours. Wait a minute, Charlie Blair, the Excalibur 3 did it in 10 hours and 15 and going. So you got me thinking about that too. So that's pretty cool.
It's amazing. You can see the changes in technology, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Blair is only what, 30 years more ish, give or take. You know,
Thank you.
so the fact that in 30 years you have that dramatic shrink, you know, incredible.
And that's one of the things that also floats my boat is the history of the technology, not the history of what it did, but the history of technology from A to B to C to D to E. And that's what got me thinking about those 20 or 30 years, whatever it was.
Awesome. That's great.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. Generous with your time and expertise, and we appreciate it. We will definitely take you up on the JRS one when we have an opportunity to do that.
Okay.
This is the second to last docent course or class of the spring semester. We're going to have another one on May 11th. That'll be our final one of the spring. It's going to be Professor Christopher Hamner. He's a professor at George Mason University, and he's going to talk about strategic bombing in World War II. So look for your evites coming out a week ahead of time. Tom, thanks again.
He's a great professor too. I highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Everybody
you.
have a great warm day, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you.